down because the spending they were planning they weren't allowed. So no, the Democrats spend as much as they can get away with, including a certain amount that they think they can get away with for deficit. The establishment press screams when they think the deficit is caused by a tax cut, and there is complete silence. I mean, how often have you heard Tom Brokaw talk about Obama's deficits? Never. It's not a discussion point. And when I was at college, I was told that all this talk about 74 to 78, all this talk about deficits was a dirty trick by Republicans to stop deficit spending, which was a good thing, and so deficits was a dirty trick to talk about deficits. When deficits could be used as a weapon against tax cuts, then all of a sudden deficits became a big interest. Then when the Democrats under Clinton wanted to spend, deficits ceased to exist as an issue. It's what they use to try and stop lower taxes, and they never use it to stop spending.
With the pledge, you've been called the most powerful man in Washington. You've been called many worse things by many people.
Yeah, that's a tough one to let – oh, stop being mean to me.
But does it ever surprise you that how well it's worked and the kind of compliance rates?
What are those compliance rates? How many people break the pledge in a given Congress, or I don't know how you measure
George Herbert Walker Bush.
Read my lips.
Yeah.
Yes.
And he took the sins of the world on himself so nobody else would have to do that.
And then we marched him off into the wilderness like a good scapegoat.
Yes, exactly. That's what happened. Nobody's life is a complete waste. Some people serve as bad examples. And children, look at that. Don't do that. I remember my parents pointing out a street person years ago, don't do that, kids. Don't grow up and do that. And they did the same thing with Bush.
Yeah.
Don't grow up and raise taxes. This is bad. When Bush raised taxes in 1990, he won the primary because he signed the pledge and Dole didn't. That's why he beat him in New Hampshire. He won the general because he said, read my lips, no new taxes. He was 14 points down when he said that. He was losing to Mike Dukakis, and they said, I'm Ronald Reagan. I won't raise your taxes. People said, oh, we thought you were George Bush. Okay, we'll vote for you. And he won because he was the guy who would not raise taxes. He was going to govern as Reagan's third term. But he didn't. He raised taxes in 90 because his advisors, who were the smartest guys in the world, they tell me, said, you're allowed to lie to the American people. You know, they don't know. You don't know them anything. And he bought it. And he treated the people the way French kings would treat peasants. You know, the nerve of these people to ask me. And Bush said that. He was on one of the cover of Parade magazine. He and his wife had this feature, and where they're supposed to be talking about life and retirement, he sort of lashes out at me. Who is Grover Norquist to ask me not to raise taxes? What? You know, geez Louise. He keeps bringing up his self-defeating mistake. He had a very successful presidency. If you look at managing the collapse of the Soviet Union without blood on the floor, a lot of people thought the Soviet Union might go down, but there'd be an awful lot of blood on the floor. He drove Iraq out of Kuwait and didn't get stuck occupying the place for a decade. A lot of wisdom, a lot of common sense. He would have won, except for one problem. He raised taxes. He broke his word. And all the Republicans watched that and said, I get it. Take the pledge, win the primary. Take the pledge, win the general. Break the pledge, lose. So keep the pledge and win. We've had almost nobody at the federal level. At the federal, after Bush, everyone said don't do that. And again, this is a guy who was up at 90%, you know, during the Iraq War, and people said he was in fine shape. And I said no. When that calms down and people focus on the tax thing, he's still in trouble. And he was.
So it's been 25 years since a federal Republican.
Yeah, there's some guys at the state level who break the pledge, and former governor of Pennsylvania signed the pledge, broke it, and didn't get reelected. So there's some local – sometimes you have to relearn these things. That some states are slower than others.
Does it ever surprise you the way people talk about it too when they say, oh, well, Grover released me from the pledge, or Grover's holding my feet to the fire.
Well,
and all
good.
This way, yeah.
I'm glad that your listenership they should write this down. The pledge, if you read it, is not to me.
It doesn't say, oh, I pledged to Grover Norquist.
It is to the American people. It is the people of it says to the people of my state and the American people that I will vote against and oppose all efforts to raise taxes. Or if you're running for president, I'll oppose and veto any efforts to raise taxes. So the pledge is to the American people, which is the idea that somebody could – it's like that scene towards the end of The Godfather Part 1, could you get me off the hook for old time's sake? Sorry, I can't. And I have to say to these guys, hey, you didn't promise me anything. You promised the voters. You go tell them that you lied to them. Don't come and ask, tell me and ask for pardon or something. I did get repeatedly asked, are you the most powerful man in the United States? By 60 Minutes when they did a 6-hour interview to get about 6 minutes of airtime, where they're looking at your pores.
Yeah.
Because they kept asking the same questions, and I kept giving them my answer, not the answer they were hoping to write into the
They wanted you to
script.
cackle and say, I am the most powerful man in America.
Yes. And then they beat me senseless for the next 12 minutes of the show. And my answer is the tax issue is the most powerful issue in American history. Go back to the founding of the country. The country almost split. My book, And the IRS Before It Ends Us, is all about the history of taxation and how it shaped the country. Everyone thought the country was going to split. Everything west of the Alleghenies would go to Spain or France or Britain or independent, and we'd only end up with the shoreline. And that was exacerbated by the whiskey tax. And
one of the great moments in American history.
Yes, the Whiskey Rebellion. The excise taxes that they put on. Then the excise taxes faded because that's how come Jefferson and the Republicans won for 24 years. They said they'd repeal the tax, and they did it. Jefferson's advisors told him, you don't really have to repeal that, now that you won. Luckily for him
there
and
was
the
no
country.
Was there great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandpa?
He said, no, I think I really do have to do this. We weren't lying at the time. But then the country almost split north-south in 1830. South Carolina called out the militia in 1830-31.
The nullification crisis.
Over the tariff, yeah. What they wanted to nullify was the tariff. And then the Civil War, there was a big part of the Civil War that was the tariff. If there had never been any slavery, we would have still had the Civil War. It just would have been over the tariffs instead of slavery and tariffs. So it's been a huge part of American history. It's a very powerful issue. And what Americans for Tax Reform's Taxpayer Protection Pledge does is it clarifies where people stand. You've signed the pledge or you haven't. Very binary. There aren't grays. And politicians come to me and say, well, I've never raised taxes. I said, if my neighbor came and said, I've never eaten your cat, but I won't put in writing that I won't, I would keep the cat inside.
Now, the book, as you mentioned, is called In the IRS Before It Ends Us. Is that title too hyperbolic?
It is not. It wasn't my choice, but I didn't – the publisher liked it. I like it now. I think it's not too hyperbolic there are two ways in which you mean get rid of the IRS. The first is the way that Bill Clinton said get rid of welfare as we know it. Get rid of the IRS that's political, that is corrupt, that targets people that they don't like, that has six the amount of time and effort that people have to put into it, the number of pages in the code. It's much too complicated. It's much too crazy. No one can fully understand it or even comply and not break the rules somehow, not meaning to. And you've seen the ones you have to ask 10 different people to do the same tax reform, tax payment, and they get 10 different answers from experts. And 9 of those guys the government could decide should go to jail because they tried to cheat you. So I think that ending the IRS as we know it, even if you kept the income tax, is a necessary step. It's not sufficient. You wouldn't want a pleasant structure that still took 20% of GDP and disincentivized work, saving, and investment. Can we do without the income tax, federal income tax? Well, the first answer is we did till 1913, so obviously you can. There are 9 states that don't have income taxes. Never have. Well, Alaska had it and then they didn't. But 9 states that don't have income taxes. As we get more and more states deciding to shed the income tax. Kansas is on track to do that. North Carolina, Mississippi's been taking votes to put themselves on that track. Watch Arizona and Maine. These states are all saying our goal is to get to zero. We have a campaign, 50 in 2050, which is to have 50 states without a state income tax by 2050. And I don't expect to do any campaigning in New York or California or Illinois. I expect to win all the states around them and drain the swamp of talent, youth, and resources and jobs. And California will get the joke or they won't.
That's like another guerrilla action.
It is. It is. We will take the countryside and surround the cities and starve them out for capital people and young people. So I think there's some real – the answer is yes. I think we can get there. But it does take a very serious focus on reducing the size and scope of government, on reforming all our pensions to make them defined contribution rather than defined benefit, to take all of the welfare structures and block grant them to the states. So you have the 57 states compete on how to provide these programs and to get costs down. So I think that we can get there. The first part should be done in the next few years. The second part will take decades.
I want to call you said 57 states. You meant all the territories in D.C. and
No, I'm making fun of the president.
Oh, okay. Did he say that?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, I did. Oh, okay. Well, I missed the joke.
He had talked about visiting all 57 states during the campaign.
What is the appropriate?
If Quayle had said that,
you would never
have had it memorized.
Yeah.
What is the appropriate amount of taxes?
Lower, less.
Okay.
Samuel Gompers, whose statue is like across the street, and I keep waiting for you guys to put a mustache on or something. But Samuel Gompers, labor leader in the 1870s, 1880s, who hated Chinese and Japanese people, but otherwise was an interesting character. He, when asked what do working people want, he said more. I mean, there isn't some number. What do we want? We want government to cost less. We want it to be more efficient, more effective, and less intrusive in people's lives. So 20% of GDP spent by the federal government is too high. 10% strikes me as probably still too high. But when we get to 10%, we'll have a conversation with the nation, and if everyone says this is swell, I'll retire and write murder mysteries. But my guess is we'll keep going to 9, 8, 7 and see how far we can get.
At what point can you drown in a bathtub? Because that quote, it's amazing. Would that surprise you how much that quote has followed you around?
Well, it is. It's because the original quote, the full quote is, my goal – this comes to what do you want? My goal is to reduce the size and scope of government as a percentage of the economy in half over 25 years. And then in the next 25 years to drop it in half again. And then I think the question was, do you keep going? I said, well, ultimately you want to reduce the government down to the size where you could drag it into the bathroom and drown it in the bathtub. So that's the exaggeration. But the first two are I believe, exactly what we can do, what we should do. Take government from 20% of GDP down to 10, and then from 10 to 5. As the economy grows, it's not the government doesn't have to get teeny, but just teeny smaller compared to the rest of our resources.
What's the path to getting there? Because on the one hand, getting Americans to get upset at politicians who raise their taxes from whatever they happen to be now is, people don't want to pay more than they are. And everyone would like to pay less. But as you mentioned, really dramatically reducing the size of government is going to involve doing away with pension programs and replacing them with, savings. And at some point, people love to pay less, but then they're not so willing to give up the things that they have. You start running into American voter constituencies that are benefiting from this stuff.
Yeah, I think it's overstated the actual desire that people have for bigger government. Half of the federal government is 20% of the economy, 10% of the economy, was enacted in two-year periods. So 4 years of American history created half of our federal government, 34 to 36, New Deal, and 64 to 66, Medicare, Medicaid. Social Security, food stamps. So there were some seeds planted in those 4 years. And it happened when you had several landslides in a row for the Democrats. They had supermajorities. They could do everything they wanted. And they put in seeds that over time grew. And it was never easy enough to cut down the tree or prune it back because it just kept growing. what the Ryan budget plan does, Paul Ryan's budget plan, I write about that in the book, is that it makes all these reforms now, but they're all ones that over time bend down the cost curve of government to where instead of 30, 40 years from now costing 40% of GDP, it takes it from 20 back to 20. And that's assuming no economic growth from better policies. I think it does much better than that. But at a minimum, it cuts government in half over the next 30, 40 years from where it would otherwise be. And that you do by reforming government, not cutting it. If you want to cut something 10%, it's like chopping somebody's head off. It's scary. But if you say we're going to lose weight and you do it over time, that's a lot easier to deal with. You do it all at once, chopping somebody's arm off is scary. But allowing somebody to lose weight over time is not scary, and it's healthy. So this is where I think we're in a position to – and you need to get 51 votes in the Senate, a majority in the House, which is 4 times voted for the Paul Ryan's plan, and a Republican president with enough digits to sign the bill. And then that puts you on a U-turn from our present road to serfdom. I mean, presently we're going to Hades not as quick as we were 3 years ago, but we're still heading in the wrong direction. We're going to end up like France, and no one will bathe or anything. So we need to fix this.
Is that going to be too much of a bitter pill, though? Because dovetailing off of Aaron's question, would those kind of cuts it would hurt some people at some point? And would that mean that if you actually signed that plan, if you were president who signed that plan, you would probably lose the next election?
Well, the President of the United States just signed a bill which in net present value drops federal spending by $3 trillion. That was the Doc Fix bill. In the first 10 years, the government spends $100 billion more than it did, and that's what they focused on. Politicians like street criminals have short time horizons. I will smash the window. I will steal the watch.
And run away.
I will go to jail. Damn, I didn't think this all the way through. Okay, politicians, if you say shiny thing here, and all you have to do is bend the cost curve on some of these Medicare payments down, not cut them in half, right? Just bend the cost curve down to where over the next 75 years the net present value is $3 trillion. Over time it's a lot more than that. And that's what the deal will be, that here is something today to make you happy. The price of that, what you get is not a tax increase but a one-time spending deal. Then in the future you alter the cost curve on entitlements, and you can drop trillions in real time. So could a Republican president do that? Well, a Democrat president just did. $3 trillion, not bad.
Doesn't that commit us to trusting them in the future, though?
No, it doesn't, because this is a law in the same way that Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid grew. They were just a law. Nobody went in and said, now we will add to this, now we will add to this on a regular basis. It just grew over time because of the way it was designed. And so those reforms, if you move from defined benefit to defined contribution, tremendous savings, but nobody has to touch it again. It just happens. It's in the structure. If you were saying, 50 years from now the appropriators promised to behave, no, that I would not trust.
Now, you mentioned the tax revolts, which is a big part of the first part of your book. And in the stats you have here, we don't have income tax until 1913. The top rate then was 7% on people who earned $500,000 or more, which would be $11.5 million in today's numbers. Only 4% of Americans even paid income tax at all. Now about half of American families pay income tax, and the bottom rate is 10%, which is higher than the top rate in 1913. Do you think that Americans have become a little bit too – given our anti-tax roots, have we become too complacent about this level of taxation we're experiencing?
Oh, yes, absolutely. But when you remind people of how much they're paying, we finally defeated the Spanish-American war tax, which is a 3% federal excise tax on long-distance phone calls.
I have a question. That story is amazing.
Simply by paying attention, by focusing on it. Look at this. This is a hidden tax. They think you're an idiot. You're still paying for the Spanish-American. People were then outraged about a tax they couldn't have told you they were paying because it was hidden in their phone bill. So when you highlight the cost of something, people will react, and we can get people to change their mind about whether or not they're willing to tolerate something.
Now, you described that Spanish-American war tax, which is just a funny sentence by itself. Remember the Maine,
Yes,
remember
yes.
the tax. We describe it as the perfect tax in here because it has all these elements to it, and it persisted for it doesn't really exist anymore. But
It's mostly gone. It's not completely gone. It's mostly gone.
But how did it come about in the original? What was the idea?
Sure. 1898, when Spain so violently attacked us and we had to defend ourselves, we needed to
and take over Guam and the
Yes,
Philippines and
that's right.
Saipan.
Serve them right. They put in a tax on long-distance phone calls charged by time and distance. At the time, a phone was $5,000 in today's dollars. Very few people had phones. Very few people made long-distance phone calls. And so it's a tax on the rich people. So of all the things politicians do to trick you into agreeing to a tax increase, this nation found in a tax revolt. Oh, it's only rich people. Okay. Oh, it's only temporary because we're having a war with Spain. Won't last forever, right? It's falling apart as it is. Okay. It's patriotic. It's a war. Okay. Henry James, the only taxes people like to pay are war taxes. That's why everything needed to be the moral equivalent of war in order to trick you into having higher taxes. The energy crisis, moral equivalent of war. Jimmy Carter, he had read his Henry James. And so all of this stuff, it was hidden in the bottom of your phone bill. So all of these things combined to make it really the perfect tax. It lasted more than 100 years. It then became a tax on everybody because 99% of Americans have phones and only really rich people can afford not to have a phone. So we went from a tax on the rich to a tax on average people. Came out at 3%. And we eventually got it mostly killed by focusing on it.
And it was but Clinton at one point did veto it.
He did. We had it all gone, and Clinton vetoed it. It was part of another package of things, and Clinton was the keeper of the Spanish-American war tax.
So yeah, and you also write more about just the relation between war and taxation in general.
Yeah, there's a long chapter. I mean, every time they have a war, the war ends and the taxes don't. The only war that really closed down all the taxes at the end of the war was the War of 1812.
Those were the days.
All the others, not only the taxes stayed, but the level of spending stayed up more than before the war. Civil War, government was sort of permanently made larger, and you saw this again with the First World War and the Second World War. Government kept getting bigger. Now, we used to spend 10% of national spending on Pentagon in the 60s, and now it's down to about 3-4%. But government's as big as it was because that money was just absorbed by other parts of the government. So our friends on the left, they like wars because it means more money for the government, and they're willing to wait to get their piece of it till after the war ends, which may be why they run anti-war campaigns to end the war quickly and keep the taxes. But they do. And there's some of the books that I looked at researching this. I'm reading these left-wing books, and they're so excited about all the taxes that the war generated. I'm going, but you were against that war.
World War I was, of course.
World War I and Vietnam, but they love the taxes that
What's
came
wrong
with
with
Vietnam.
seeing a silver lining?
That's right, in other people's deaths and misery. But yes, war is the health of the state, and it is how you grow the government, and then it doesn't snap back.